Tyrion Lannister sat alone in his black cell, the stale air pressing down on him like a leaden hand. The offer Varys had whispered still rang in his ears: freedom, an escape to Essos, a life unchained. But it came at a price, freeing Jaime, his beloved brother. Tyrion hesitated. The bitterness of Shay's betrayal, the mockery of his trial, and the cold certainty that his family had abandoned him, all swirled together inside him like a storm. In this version of the tale, Tyrion chose not to free Jaime. "I love you, brother," Tyrion muttered into the darkness. "But love has brought me nothing but ruin." When Varys came to lead him out of the cell, Tyrion shook his head. "No, let them have me. Let him have me." And so Tyrion faced the dawn and his execution. His last request, a simple one, was denied. No trial by combat, no mercy, only cold steel and the howling of a crowd thirsty for blood. Tyrion Lannister died with a curse on his lips, not at peace, but burning with hatred. In the Red Keep, Jaime sat chained in the dungeons, broken by the news of Tyrion's death. The guards were rougher now, no longer restrained by the fear of Tywin's wrath. Cersei rarely visited. When she did, her eyes burned with a manic light. "You chose him over me," she would hiss. "You betrayed me for a monster." Jaime's heart withered, a little more each day, but Tywin Lannister was not a man to waste good blood. He knew Jaime's death would shock the realm, weaken the throne, so he plotted, schemed, delayed the inevitable. But enemies within the court grew bolder. The Tyrells whispered behind closed doors. Oberyn Martell, furious over Tyrion's execution, renewed his accusations of Lannister crimes. Tensions boiled. Meanwhile, Brienne of Tarth, unaware of the new horrors unfolding in King's Landing, rode north in search of Sansa Stark, holding on to the promise Jaime had once made her swear to keep, a promise now lost in the abyss. In the streets of King's Landing, the people murmured. The imp was dead. The Kingslayer rotted in a cell. Cersei sat closer to the throne, wearing her grief like a crown of thorns, and Tommen Baratheon, the boy king, grew more isolated by the day. The cracks in the Red Keep's foundations widened. Winter loomed far away. Daenerys Targaryen ruled over Meereen, unaware that the mighty lion of the Westerlands was beginning to devour itself from within. Had Tyrion lived and fled to her side, things might have been different. But in this world, dragons and dwarves would never meet. Not yet. In the silent hours before his trial, Jaime remembered a promise Tyrion had once made him. "I'll be your champion if ever you need one." And now, with Tyrion dead and his own fate sealed, Jaime realized he was truly alone. The bells of the Great Sept rang out, not for a wedding nor a coronation, but for the death of a son, a brother, a kingdom's last hope. The first stone of House Lannister's downfall had been thrown, and no one could stop the avalanche that would follow. The Red Keep groaned under the weight of its own deceit. Tywin Lannister, Lord of Casterly Rock and Hand of the King, sat in his solar brooding. His son was dead. His other son, the Kingslayer, was imprisoned beneath the castle, a festering wound on the Lannister name. This was not how Tywin had planned. Tyrion's death had not silenced the whispers. It had fed them. Oberyn Martell, poisoned by grief and anger, did not return to Dorne quietly. He stayed fanning the flames, weaving his influence through the court. The Tyrells, once allies, now hesitated. Margaery continued to play her part as the blushing bride-to-be for Tommen, but behind her sweet smiles Lady Olenna plotted. Even the Faith of the Seven, smelling weakness, began to move against the crown. Cersei, meanwhile, grew more unstable with each passing day. Her hatred for Tyrion had blinded her to the consequences of his death. She imagined herself victorious, yet she saw enemies in every corner, every whisper in the halls, every smirk from a nobleman, every sigh from Maester Pycelle. They all became conspiracies in her mind, and Jaime wasted away. The proud knight, once the finest swordsman in the realm, now a shell. His gaunt face and sunken eyes barely resembled the golden lion he once was. They stripped him of his white cloak, his dignity, and his purpose. For Cersei, it was easier to pretend he was already dead. For Tywin, it was an inconvenient problem, a loose thread to be cut or hidden. It was Sir Kevan Lannister, Tywin's loyal brother, who spoke the truth no one dared. "We cannot keep him in chains forever," Kevan said, standing before Tywin's carved oak desk. "It weakens us. If we execute Jaime, we make him a martyr. If we release him, we shame ourselves." Tywin's jaw tightened. His legacy was slipping through his fingers. "There is another way," Tywin murmured. "Send him away, to the wall." Kevan blinked. "A Lannister in black? You would condemn your own son?" "I would save what's left of our name," Tywin said coldly. "Jaime can find redemption there. Siku or death, either suits me." Thus a decision was made. Jaime Lannister would take the Black, stripped of all titles, lands and honors. He would be exiled to the Night's Watch, where his oath-breaking could be washed away in a sea of ice and shadow. It was a sentence disguised as mercy. The day Jaime was led through the streets toward the ship that would carry him north, the people gathered to watch. Some jeered, some wept. Most simply stared, unsure whether to pity or scorn the fallen knight. He was no longer the Kingslayer. He was no longer the heir of Casterly Rock. He was just another man defeated by the Game of Thrones. In the shadows of Flea Bottom, a cloaked figure watched Jaime's slow procession. Varys, the spider, wrung his hands together under his sleeves. The death of Tyrion had been an unexpected blow to his intricate web of plans. Tyrion had been meant to survive, to be a player across the sea, to light fires in Daenerys Targaryen's name. But now the realm teetered closer to chaos, and Varys hated chaos. He turned away from the spectacle and slipped back into the labyrinth of tunnels beneath the city. New plans must be made. New allies must be found. If the Lannisters could not be trusted to hold the realm together, perhaps it was time for new rulers entirely. Meanwhile, across the narrow sea, Daenerys Targaryen ruled a fragile peace in Meereen. Rumors of Westeros reached her ears on the lips of merchants and sellswords. The death of the imp, the fall of the Kingslayer, the madness of the Queen Mother. "Good," she said to herself, stroking the scaled neck of Drogon. "Let them devour each other. When the time comes, I will cross the water, and there will be no lions left to roar." Her dragons grew larger with each passing day. Her army hardened, and her dreams burned brighter. Dreams of conquest, of fire and blood. On the wall, the Night's Watch struggled to hold the line against the rising dead. They knew nothing of the politics of King's Landing, nor cared. Yet soon they would welcome a broken lion into their ranks. A man who had once thought himself better than all others, now humbled by loss and exile. But even there, fate was not finished with Jaime Lannister. Not by a long shot. The chill of the north cut deeper than any blade Jaime Lannister had ever known. As the ship neared Eastwatch by the sea, the salt spray froze against his tattered black cloak, and the once proud knight shivered like a common beggar. Gone were the silks, the golden armor, the lordly titles. Here at the end of the world he was just another man condemned to watch and wait for death. When he disembarked, the Black Brothers barely gave him a second glance. He was just another recruit now, just another penitent seeking to wash away his sins in endless winters. But among the grizzled faces at the wall, one recognized him. Jon Snow, the newly elected Lord Commander, stood on the battlements, his dire wolf, ghost at his side. He watched Jaime with narrowed eyes. He had heard the tales. The Kingslayer, the man who murdered a king sworn to protect. The man whispered to be a coward and an oathbreaker. Yet Jon also knew what it meant to be judged for your blood, for your choices, for your sins both real and imagined. He decided to give Jaime the chance few others would. Jaime's life at the wall was harsh beyond imagining. His missing hand made sword practice brutal. The cold gnawed at the stump like a hungry wolf. The men mocked him behind his back. "A Lannister," they sneered, a crippled lion among crows. But he endured. Every morning he stood at the practice yard, battering his body into obedience. Every evening he patrolled the frozen battlements, staring into the haunted woods, daring the darkness to claim him. Slowly, begrudgingly, respect grew. Sir Dennis Mallister taught him the bow. Cotter Pike showed him how to swing an axe with one hand. Jon Snow himself, ever the silent observer, began to nod at Jaime's progress. In time, Jaime Lannister became something he had not been in years. Useful. Beyond the wall, darker forces stirred. The dead marched, silent and merciless. Villages disappeared overnight. Wildling survivors fled south in growing numbers, seeking sanctuary from an enemy that could not be killed by ordinary steel. One evening, as the brothers gathered in the grate hall for a rare hot meal, a raven arrived from Hardhome. The message was simple, chilling. "They are coming." Jon Snow stood and addressed the men. "We ride at first light," he said, "all of us." Jaime watched him, a spark flickering in the ashes of his soul. Here was a leader, not a schemer, not a butcher, but a true man of honor, the kind of man Jaime had once dreamed of becoming long ago. The wall needed every sword, crippled or not, and Jaime Lannister would not be the one to fail it. Meanwhile, in King's Landing, Cersei's madness blossomed into full bloom. The death of Tyrion had brought her no peace. The exile of Jaime had hollowed her, and the growing power of the Faith, militant, led by the High Sparrow, threatened what little control she still possessed. In desperation, she struck deals with dangerous men. She armed the Faith, believing them to be loyal lapdogs. She turned against her own uncle, Ser Keevan. She dismissed wise counsel and surrounded herself with flatterers and fools. And when the Faith turned their judgmental gaze upon her, when they demanded penance for her own sins, she found herself trapped in the very cage she had built for others. The bells tolled again in King's Landing, and this time it was Cersei herself who was dragged through the streets, shorn of pride, naked beneath the gaze of thousands. The lioness had fallen, and Tywin Lannister, still alive but weakened, could only watch as his dynasty crumbled into dust. Far across the sea, Varys's whispers reached Daenerys Targaryen's ears. "The lions are wounded," he told her. "The realm is adrift. If you strike now, you can claim what is yours." Daenerys stared into the flames. She saw visions of a broken crown, a bleeding city, a throne made of swords, and in the midst of it, she saw her destiny. She rose from her seat and called for her captains. "Prepare the ships," she said. "We sail for Westeros." The storm was coming, and the lions, once mighty, now stood vulnerable before it. At the wall, as dawn broke and the Black brothers gathered for war, Jaime Lannister cinched the black cloak tighter around his shoulders. He looked north, where the white mist rolled like an endless tide. There, in the heart of winter, Jaime would find a new purpose, or die trying. The wind howled like a chorus of the damned, as the Black brothers stood assembled at the foot of the wall. Their torches flickered wildly, tiny, defiant flames against the frozen darkness beyond. Jon Snow rode among them, his face grim and set. Ghost, the great white direwolf, loped silently at his side. Every man who could wield a blade was there, even the sick, even the old, even Jaime Lannister. Jaime adjusted the leather strap around his ruined wrist. His sword, a short, brutal thing he had trained with for months, hung heavy at his side. He met Jon's gaze and gave a short nod. No words were needed. When the gates of Castle Black groaned open and the riders poured into the night, Jaime was among the first through. The journey to Hardhome was a nightmare. The snow never ceased. The cold burrowed into the bones. The horses stumbled and wheezed. Men fell from their saddles and were buried beneath drifts without even a burial prayer. And then they saw it. Hardhome, or what was left of it. The village. Smouldered under a curtain of grey ash. Frozen bodies lay everywhere. Men, women, children, wildlings slaughtered without mercy. The air reeked of burnt flesh and despair. Jon ordered the men to move carefully. They found a few survivors, gaunt, terrified, clinging to life with bleeding hands. Among them was Tormund Giantsbane, face battered but eyes burning. "They're coming," Tormund rasped. "The dead. We can't stay." No sooner had the words left his mouth than the mist thickened, and the world went silent. The first wights stumbled into view, hundreds of them, eyes like cold stars, and behind them, atop skeletal horses, rode the White Walkers. The battle at Hardhome would be sung about, if anyone survived to sing. Jaime fought with a ferocity he had forgotten he possessed. His sword hacked and stabbed and parried in a relentless rhythm. Sweat froze on his skin. Blood steamed in the freezing air. He moved like a man possessed, driven not by honor nor by duty, but by pure, grim defiance. A boy, no older than Bran Stark had been, lunged at him with clawed hands. Jaime gritted his teeth and drove his blade through the boy's heart, even as something inside him broke a little more. All around, the Black Brothers and wildlings fought back to back, hacking down whites only for more to take their place. For every dozen they slew, 24 more rose. Jon Snow found himself face to face with a White Walker, their blades clashing with a shriek like shattering ice. Longclaw, his Valyrian steel sword, met the Walker's blade and shattered it, sending the creature howling into mist. But for every victory, the tide grew stronger, and then the Night King himself appeared, tall, silent, terrible. From a rocky ridge, he lifted one cold hand, and the dead rose again. The battle turned to slaughter. Jaime knew they couldn't win. The realization was like ice water down his spine. He saw Jon fighting to reach the ships, saw Tormund dragging survivors to safety. Jaime made his choice. He grabbed a fallen horn and blew a deep, desperate note. "To the ships!" he roared, his voice ragged. He covered the retreat, standing back to back with Jon and a handful of brothers. Every swing of his sword was slower now, heavier, but he refused to yield. A white clamped rotten fingers around his leg. Another slashed at his side. Jaime cried out but did not fall. He fought like a cornered lion, bloody, snarling, proud. When at last he stumbled onto the final boat, half dead, he collapsed into the bottom and stared up at the stormy sky. The sea. Last thing he saw before the mist swallowed the shore was the Night King, watching him silent and cold. They made it back to Castle Black with half their number. The survivors stumbled through the gates, broken and bloodied but alive. Jon stood atop the wall, staring out across the endless white expanse, his hands clenched into fists. "We cannot stop them," he said, voice low. "Not alone." Beside him, Jaime wiped blood from his face and looked northward. "I know what it's like to be called an oath-breaker," he said quietly. "But the truth is, Jon Snow, I never had an oath worth keeping." He looked at the wall, the last shield between the living and the dead. Until now. Far to the south, the Iron Throne trembled. Ravens flew with dire news. Wildlings flooding south, the north on edge, the wall preparing for war. But King's Landing, obsessed with its petty games, barely took notice. Cersei stewed in her chambers, plotting revenge on her enemies. Tywin grew weaker by the day, trying to hold a crumbling court together. They did not see the real enemy marching from the darkness. They would not see until it was far, far too late. At Castle Black, the survivors of Hardhome healed their wounds and buried their dead. But there was no time to mourn. The enemy would not wait. Jon Snow called a council of the Night's Watch and the wildlings who had bent the knee after the battle. Jaime Lannister stood at the edge of the room, cloaked in black like the rest, but he could feel the weight of their stares. A Lannister among them. The name still carried poison. Jon pounded his fist on the war table. "If the 7 kingdoms do not unite," he said, voice firm, "the wall will fall, and the living will fall with it." Murmurs filled the hall. Some shouted it was folly, that the South would never heed the call of the Night's Watch. Others said to let the South rot, that they deserved what was coming. Jaime stepped forward. "They won't listen to a bastard from the north," he said, voice cutting through the noise, "or a wildling king." He pulled off his glove and revealed the golden stump of his missing hand. "But they will listen to a Lannister." Jon's grey eyes met his. "You would speak for us?" Jaime smiled bitterly. "I have no name left to disgrace." Thus it was decided. Ravens would be sent, messages written in Jaime's own hand, bearing the lion seal of House Lannister. A desperate plea for help, a warning of doom. The ravens flew south, their black wings cutting through grey skies. One landed at Casterly Rock, where Tywin Lannister sat slumped on his throne, coughing blood into a silken cloth. He read the letter from Jaime once, then again, his face stony. "White walkers," he spat weakly, "children's tales." But somewhere deep inside fear stirred. Tywin had ruled by control, by fear, by ruthless calculation. But how could you control death itself? He summoned Kevan. "Send scouts north," Tywin ordered. "Verify this madness." Kevan hesitated. "And if it's true?" Tywin closed his eyes. "Then we must choose. War against the dead, or against ourselves? In King's Landing, Cersei received the letter too. She ripped it open with trembling fingers, her golden hair unkempt, her mind unsteady. Jaime's handwriting stared back at her. The dead come. Unite the realm or perish. Cersei laughed in a shrill, broken sound. Another of his tricks, she hissed. He wants me to kneel, to beg him to come back. She tossed the letter into the fire without a second thought. The smell of burning parchment filled the chamber, but not all were blind. At Highgarden, Lady Olenna Tyrell read Jaime's letter and tapped her cane against the floor. Fools, she said to her granddaughter Margaery, fighting over scraps while winter devours the feast. Olenna dispatched riders to rally forces in the Reach. If the realm crumbled, she intended to be among the few left standing. Meanwhile, across the narrow sea, Daenerys Targaryen's fleet finally caught favorable winds. Her dragons soared above the ships, roaring, their shadows blackening the waves. Varys whispered to her of the letters from the wall, of the threat beyond anything Westeros had ever known. "Dead men walking?" Ser Jorah said with a frown. "Surely, it's superstition." But Daenerys was silent. Her blood remembered. Old Valyria had fallen to fire and magic, and she, the last dragon, would not be so easily fooled by southern arrogance. "If the dead are real," she said, "then they will burn like all my enemies." Back at the wall, days turned into weeks. Jon grew restless. Tormund grew impatient. And Jaime waited. Every day he climbed the wall, staring south, hoping to see banners on the horizon. None came. Winter deepened. The dead marched. In the high quiet of the night, Jaime sat by the fire, sharpening his sword. Jon approached, wrapped in a heavy black cloak. "You still believe they'll answer?" Jon asked. Jaime looked into the flames. "I don't know," he said honestly. "But if we ride south, without trying, if we abandon hope completely, we are no better than the dead." He glanced at Jon, a tired smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Hope is a fool's game, Snow, but sometimes it's the only game left." Far beyond sight, the Night King stood at the head of his army, gazing at the wall. Ice cracked beneath his boots. Frost spread across his blade. The wall had stood for thousands of years, but even mountains fall to time, and he was very, very patient. Snow fell in sheets so thick it swallowed the world. Atop the wall, Jon Snow stood with Jaime Lannister, both cloaked in black, both facing a fate written in ice. No banners flew in the distance, no armies came marching. The South had abandoned them. "They're here," Tormund growled, squinting into the swirling storm. And then they saw them, a river of corpses stretching across the tundra, endless and silent. At their head rode the Night King, his blade of ice gleaming in the pale light. The ground trembled. The wall, that ancient shield of the realm, began to crack. "Archers!" Jon shouted. Flaming arrows rained down, felling dozens of wights, but for every one destroyed, a dozen more clawed forward. The Night King raised one pale hand, a spear of black ice formed in his grasp. Jaime watched, heart pounding. One fluid motion, the Night King hurled the spear, and it struck the wall with a sound like a god's scream. A massive crack raced up the stones. Chunks of ancient ice crumbled away. The wall, which had stood for thousands of years, began to fall. Jaime grabbed Jon by the arm. "Retreat!" he bellowed. "Now!" The brothers of the Night's Watch fled, pulling wildlings and survivors with them. Below, the main gates shattered under the weight of whites swarming forward. It was chaos, blood, steel, and death everywhere. In the midst of it, Jaime found himself face to face with a white walker, its eyes cold as the grave. He swung his sword. The creature parried easily, sending Jaime stumbling. Another came from behind. He was surrounded. Jaime fought like a man possessed, one-handed, barely holding the beasts at bay. Steel rang, bones cracked. Frost bit at his skin. Then Jon leapt into the fray, Longclaw gleaming. Together they fought back to back. It wasn't enough. The wall was lost. At Winterfell, Sansa Stark received word. The wall had fallen. The dead were marching south. Her heart clenched. She knew no one in King's Landing would believe it until the dead were at their gates. And by then, it would be too late. Sansa looked to the maesters and bannermen gathered around her. "We fight," she said simply, "or we die." The North would stand, alone if necessary. Far across the sea, Daenerys Targaryen's fleet finally sighted the shores of Westeros. At Dragonstone, she landed with her armies and her dragons. There she learned the truth from Varys and Tyrion's old allies. The wall had fallen. The dead marched and the realm was leaderless. Tyrion was dead. Jaime was at the wall. The Lannisters were broken. For a moment Daenerys wondered what might have been if the imp had lived, if he had stood beside her, sharp and clever. But that hope was gone. She would forge ahead without him, fire against. Heis, dragons against death. At the Trident, Jaime and Jon met with Northern Lords and remaining Night's Watch brothers to form a desperate plan. "We cannot outrun them," Jon said. "We must fight, here." They would make their stand at the ancient river crossing, the place where kings once fell and kingdoms were born. Men, women, children, all took up arms. Smiths forged weapons of dragon glass. Maesters brewed wildfire. There would be no retreat, no surrender. Jaime stood before the ragged army, battered and scarred, yet unbowed. "This is no Game of Thrones," he said, voice carrying over the crowd. "This is life or death. Fight not for houses. Fight not for crowns. Fight for the living." The crowd roared. When the Night King's army came, it came like a tidal wave, the Aoi. Battle was a nightmare made real. Whites crashed into shields. Giants, reanimated and roaring, smashed through defenses. The very earth trembled under the clash of life and death. Jon fought atop a crumbling hill, cutting down whites by the dozens. Daenerys arrived in a fury of fire, her dragons setting the sky ablaze. Drogon and Rhaegal burned swathes through the dead, but even dragonfire could not destroy the Night King. Jaime fought alongside Brienne of Tarth, reunited by fate. Both swung their weapons until their arms failed them, until blood and sweat blinded their eyes. Then Jaime saw him, the Night King, striding through the chaos toward Jon. Jaime remembered a day long ago when he had slain a king to save the realm, and he knew what he must do. With a roar, Jaime charged. He plunged his broken sword, when reforged with dragonglass, into the Night King's side. The Night King turned icy eyes on him. For a terrible heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the Night King cracked, fissures spreading across his frozen form, and he shattered into 1,000 shards of ice. The dead collapsed instantly. The battle ended, not with a cheer, but with silence. Shocked, exhausted, stunned, Jaime Lannister lay on the ground, bleeding, barely conscious. Jon knelt beside him. "You did it," Jon whispered. Jaime gave a faint, crooked smile. For once, kept an oath. His golden hair was soaked in blood. His breathing slowed. "Tell Tyrion," Jaime said, voice fading. I tried." And then, quietly, the Kingslayer, the man who had lived with the shame of betrayal his whole life, died a hero. The snows melted slowly in the aftermath. Spring crept back into the world, timid and unsure. The realm remembered the fallen, a bastard who became a king, a lion who saved the living, a dragon queen who burned the darkness away. Tyrion's ghost lived on in the peace he never saw, and Jaime Lannister, in the songs of bards and the hearts of men, was remembered not as the Kingslayer, but as the man who slew death itself.